The tray landed in front of her with a sound that made the room fall still. A dull metal clang that sent a shiver through the air, cutting through the chatter and the hum of distant machinery. For a moment, Elsa Bauer didn't move. She simply stared at the food, if it could even be called that. It was too colorful, too fragrant, too warm to belong to anything she had known these past 3 years. Steam rose from the plate. Thick slices of roasted meat, their edges glistening with melted fat, rested beside a mound of something pale and smooth. Potatoes, maybe, though they looked impossibly white. And spread right across the meat like a cruel mistake was a bright red jelly that gleamed under the light. It was the color of blood mixed with glass, the kind of red that didn't belong in a soldier's meal. Elsa's fingers twitched above the tray but didn't reach for it. She had been a nurse in a field hospital outside Bremen, had served through bombings and shortages and winters where bread came in slices thinner than paper. The human body could adapt to pain, she had learned, but not to plenty. The body forgot what to do with abundance. A voice broke her trance. "Eat up before it cools," said a young man in olive green uniform, his accent broad and bright. He smiled, a real smile, and tapped the side of her tray with the back of his knuckle. "Turkey and cranberry sauce," he added, as if that explained everything. "Turkey and—" "What?" The words sounded strange in her ears, too soft, too domestic. Elsa blinked at him, searching his expression for mockery. But he was already walking away, whistling under his breath, the rhythm light and careless. Across the table, 30 women in identical gray dresses sat motionless, eyes fixed on their trays. The smell of roasted meat filled the mess hall, heavy with butter and herbs and something faintly sweet. Someone near the end of the table muttered in German. They mixed the courses, dessert on top of the meat. A few women nodded, lips pressed thin. It had to be a mistake. Or maybe a test. The Americans were watching, after all, guards leaning against the walls, nurses moving between tables. They wanted to see how the German prisoners reacted. Would they complain? Refuse? Laugh? Elsa gripped her fork like a weapon. Her stomach churned with suspicion and hunger in equal measure. She had spent the voyage from Europe chewing on cold turnip slices and swallowing air, to trick her body into silence. The last time she'd tasted something warm was the broth made from horse bones on the transport ship. Now she stared at this mountain of food. White, green, brown, red, and couldn't tell if it was mercy or mockery. The woman beside her, Marta, leaned close enough that Elsa could feel her breath. "Don't touch it," she whispered. "Wait to see what the Americans do." Elsa glanced across the room. At the far table, American nurses in crisp white uniforms were eating the exact same meal. One of them laughed, her voice ringing clear like a song. Another poured something golden from a glass bottle, gravy maybe, over her food. None of them hesitated. None of them looked disgusted. Elsa took a slow breath, lifted her fork, and cut into the slice of meat. The red jelly bled across the white potatoes as the knife sank in. She raised a small piece to her mouth and braced herself. The taste was a betrayal. Sweet and savory collided, the sharp tang of the cranberry cutting through the salt of the roasted meat. For an instant, her body forgot to be afraid. The flavor hit something deep in her, memory maybe, or longing, and her throat tightened. She had forgotten what real food tasted like. Her hand trembled, and the fork clattered against the tray. The sound was so loud in the silence that half the women flinched. A guard looked over briefly but said nothing. Elsa covered her mouth with her hand, swallowing the taste, the tears that came with it. Marta stared at her. "Well?" she whispered. Elsa couldn't speak. She just nodded, barely, as the warmth spread through her chest like a slow fever. One by one, others began to eat. Quietly, hesitantly. The hall filled with the faint sound of metal against tin, of chewing, of small involuntary sighs. An older woman 2 seats down, Ingrid, the cook's assistant, was crying into her napkin. "I thought the whole world was starving," she murmured, voice trembling. "I thought everyone was hungry." Elsa's eyes burned. She thought of the winter of '44, when she had given her bread rations to a wounded soldier and lived 3 days on water. She thought of her mother trading her wedding ring for flour. She thought of all the speeches, all the promises of victory through sacrifice, and here, in the land of her supposed enemy, she was being fed like a guest. When the American nurse passed by again, Elsa found her voice. Why this food?" The nurse smiled softly. "Because it's Thanksgiving." "Thanksgiving?" The woman nodded. tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "Holiday about gratitude," she said. "You girls eat. You need it." The word gratitude lingered in Elsa's mind long after the nurse had walked away. She took another bite of turkey, slower this time, letting the sweetness of the cranberry coat her tongue. It no longer tasted strange. It tasted like something else, something dangerous. It tasted like kindness. The mess hall stayed quiet even after the clatter of utensils died. Only the radio filled the silence, a tinny voice crooning in English to a melody that seemed too joyful for a place like this. Elsa sat motionless, her fork resting on the edge of the tray. The cranberry stain bled across her potatoes like a map of something she could not name. She looked around the room. 30 women, 30 faces caught between suspicion and surrender. Some were still eating cautiously, as if every bite might turn into a trap. Others had pushed their trays away, overwhelmed by fullness or fear, or both. Marta, who had been strong through everything, the shelling, the surrender, the endless waiting, was now shaking quietly. Her napkin was clutched tight in both hands. "It's too much," she whispered. "They must be mocking us. Look at this, real butter, real meat. They're laughing at us." Elsa wanted to agree, to say something bitter that would make it easier to hate them again, but she couldn't. The food was too good, too human. The act too sincere. An American nurse came down their row again, carrying a pitcher of something golden and steaming. "Gravy?" she asked cheerfully. "Anyone want more?" No one answered. The nurse smiled anyway and poured a little over Elsa's tray. "That'll help," she said. "It's made from the drippings, best part of the bird." The smell rose in a warm, buttery wave. Elsa blinked rapidly. Her chest ached in ways she didn't have words for. "Why would they feed us like this?" Greta muttered across the table. "After what we did. After everything." Elsa didn't answer. She didn't know how. From the corner of the room, an older woman stood abruptly. Frau Keller, once a head nurse in Hamburg, now a prisoner like the rest, lifted her tray in both trembling hands. "Why?" she demanded, her accent cutting through the room like a blade. "Why feed enemies like this?" The nearest American, a cook with a round face and dark skin, looked up from his station. "Ma'am?" he said gently. "This." She gestured at the trays, the steaming food, the music. "You treat us better than we were treated at home." "Why?" The cook paused, wiping his hands on a towel. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he simply shrugged. "Because the war's over, ma'am," he said. "And hungry people shouldn't stay hungry." He turned back to his work as if he hadn't just shattered something sacred. Frau Keller sank slowly back into her seat. No one spoke again. The truth was too big for words. Elsa pushed her tray aside and leaned back. Her stomach hurt, not from sickness, but from fullness. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt that particular pain. Through the high windows, sunlight spilled across the concrete floor in wide, careless stripes. Outside, the Mississippi air shimmered. She could see 2 guards smoking, their laughter soft and ordinary. The radio changed songs, something fast now, with horns that rose and dipped like laughter. Elsa caught herself tapping her foot under the table. The realization made her blush. She stopped, hands tightening in her lap. Music wasn't supposed to feel good anymore. Across from her, Marta stared down at her plate. "You think they know how strange this feels?" Elsa looked over. How could they? Marta nodded, silent. The Americans had grown up with plenty. With coffee, sugar, chocolate. With songs that weren't written for marching. They had no idea what it meant to live in ration lines, to burn furniture for heat, to dig in the frozen earth for roots. To them, this was just lunch. But for Elsa, it was an earthquake. The mess hall emptied slowly. Trays clattered into bins. Guards joked. The women shuffled back toward the barracks, each moving like she was carrying something invisible and heavy. Outside, the sun was low, painting the camp in gold. Elsa walked slowly, her eyes drawn to the laundry line stretched between 2 poles. On it, white shirts fluttered in the wind, so clean they hurt to look at. She thought of home, of the dark gray air of Bremen, of the hollow faces on the trams, of the night she had walked past a bakery and smelled bread she couldn't afford to buy. She'd been told that America was decadent, that its people were lazy and spoiled, that their comfort made them weak. But if this was weakness, what did strength even mean? In the barracks, the women undressed in silence. Someone began to hum softly, a tune Elsa recognized from before the war, a lullaby her mother used to sing. She lay down on her bunk and closed her eyes. The smell of cranberry and roasted meat clung to her hair. The taste still lingered on her tongue, stubborn and real. For the first time in years, she fell asleep full. And in that uneasy sleep, her mind whispered one question that refused to leave her. What if they weren't the monsters after all? The morning came too bright, almost offensive in its warmth. The camp smelled faintly of coffee and smoke, and somewhere a radio played a tune that fluttered like birdsong through the open barracks window. Elsa blinked into the light and reached for her cup of water, her hands still trembling from dreams she couldn't remember. The other women were already stirring. Marta was sitting on the edge of her bunk, combing her hair with slow, deliberate strokes. Greta stood by the window, squinting into the distance where the kitchen smoke rose in lazy curls. None of them spoke for a while. The silence was heavy but not tense. It was the quiet of people who had seen something they didn't know how to name. When the breakfast bell rang, they filed out in order, gray dresses swaying in the soft southern breeze. The mess hall smelled of flour and something fried. The same young sergeant from the day before was ladling out portions with a grin that seemed too ordinary for a man surrounded by enemies. "Morning, ladies," he said cheerfully. "We got biscuits and eggs today. Oh, and hash browns. Careful, they're hot." Elsa stared at the tray in disbelief. Biscuits, eggs, potatoes fried in oil until golden. Her stomach turned over. Even the smell of so much fat was enough to make her dizzy. Greta leaned in close, whispering in German, "They're mocking us again. No one eats like this twice in 2 days." But when they sat down, Elsa noticed the Americans at the next table eating the same food, laughing between mouthfuls, passing salt and ketchup as if this were all perfectly ordinary. She picked up her fork. The eggs were soft, the potatoes crisp, the biscuits warm enough to steam when she tore one open. Butter melted instantly into its center. For a long moment, she simply stared at it. Then she ate. The first bite broke her. It wasn't the taste, it was the normalcy. The way no one guarded their portions. The way no one stared or measured or hoarded. It was a world without ration cards, without fear of tomorrow's hunger. Her vision blurred. She looked down quickly, pretending to focus on the tray. Across the table, Marta was wiping her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. "It's just food," she whispered, half to herself. "Just food, and I can't stop crying." Elsa reached for her water, her hand shaking. "We were taught they were soft," she said quietly. "Weak because they had too much." Marta gave a broken laugh. "Then why do they seem stronger than we ever were?" A young American nurse passed by their table, smiling as she refilled cups. "You girls sleep all right?" she asked, her voice light. Elsa hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, thank you." "Good," the nurse said. "We've got pie for lunch." She walked away before Elsa could respond. Pie. The word sounded ridiculous, impossible, like a rumor. Greta leaned back, her voice low. "Do you think they pity us?" Elsa didn't know. Maybe pity wasn't the right word. Whatever this was, it felt deeper than that, something almost cruel in its kindness. They were being shown a version of life they'd been told didn't exist. When breakfast ended, the women returned to the yard for roll call. The sun had risen high, turning the air thick and bright. Elsa squinted toward the horizon. Beyond the barbed wire, she could see a field, green, whole, untouched. It looked like a painting of peace. For a long time, she stood there, letting the sound of laughter drift from the mess hall behind her. The guards were talking about football. Someone shouted, someone else laughed, and then the radio started up again. Jazz this time, wild and joyful. The same kind of music they'd called degenerate back home. The rhythm seeped through the air, soft but persistent. Elsa felt it in her chest before she recognized it in her ears. Without realizing, she was smiling. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the tree line, Elsa sat outside the barracks with Marta and Greta. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and distant barbecue smoke from the guard station. For a while, they didn't talk. They just listened. The crickets, the faint hum of the radio, the laughter from somewhere beyond the fence. Finally, Marta spoke. "It's strange," she said softly. "I thought defeat would taste like ashes, but it tastes like butter." Greta chuckled weakly. "And red jam." They laughed then, the sound shaky but real. When the bell signaled lights out, Elsa hesitated before going in. She turned back once more toward the kitchen building. Through the window she could see the cook, a tall man, sleeves rolled up, humming to himself as he scrubbed a pan. He caught her watching and lifted a hand in a lazy wave. For a second she almost waved back. Inside, the barracks were dark except for the soft glow of a single lantern. Elsa climbed into her bunk and lay staring at the ceiling, the faint rhythm of the radio pulsing through the walls. She pressed her hand against her stomach, full, warm, alive, and yet, somewhere deep inside, something else stirred. A hollow ache that had nothing to do with hunger. A quiet, dangerous thought. If they could feed us like this, what else could they undo? The question stayed with her long after the light flickered out, long after the last note of music faded into the dark. Maren had learned to fold hunger into silence the way other women folded bandages, quickly, neatly, and without looking anyone in the eye. In Berlin, she had counted crusts by the hour and measured kindness by how many crusts it bought. She had sewn warmed socks for boys who smelled of diesel and fear, stitched names into shirts that would never be washed again. So when a young private with oversized boots and a grin that looked younger than his face handed her a small brown rectangle in the laundry tent, her fingers reacted before her memory could protest. The wrapper was thin, creased at the edges, stamped with letters she could not read fast enough. For a moment she only smelled it, dark and honest and sweet, like something her childhood kitchens had kept secret in a locked tin. She unwrapped it in the dim, careful as a woman handling a letter from a dead relative, and the first bite split the years open. Chocolate did not behave like propaganda. It did not lecture or intimidate, it softened. It made the inside of her chest unclench, and without warning the world shifted. By morning the rumor had spread with a speed that made gossip look slow. Boxes in the staff room, a stack like firewood, a guard who shrugged and said nobody's even eating them, as if that were ordinary news. Women clustered in borrowed sunlight, fingers sticky with chocolate dust, passing pieces around as if they were currency and confession at once. Each new wrapper sparked a small sacrament. Someone would break a square, hold it reverently between thumb and forefinger, and for a heartbeat the camp's geometry changed. A seamstress from Leipzig who had not allowed herself a private sob in years laughed until she hiccuped. The cook's assistant, who never cried, dropped her head and wept into her apron as the flavor remembered her. A youth she had thought buried under ration cards and orders. These were not only sweets, they were proof, blunt and incandescent, that some of what they had been taught to believe about the enemy might be wrong. Food rearranged belief the way weather rearranges a landscape, slowly at first, then all at once. The first big meal, turkey with a smear of tart, red sauce, arrived one Thursday and looked to them like a mistake. Portions the size of fists, butter that gleamed, potatoes so whipped they looked like clouds. The mess hall smelled of fat, and spice in an abundance that was obscene for anyone who remembered stringing a loaf over 3 days. Dorothea leaned close and whispered, "It's a test, because old instincts die hard." But the nurses on the other side of the room lifted their forks and ate with an ease and a laughter that gave no theater. They treated the food like a thing that simply existed, not a trap to be navigated. When an American woman stopped to tell them, "It's Thanksgiving," it landed like a word from another country. Harvest, abundance, ritual of plenty, concepts Maren had only read about in school and then shredded by war. As the women ate, trembling between distrust and hunger, something practical happened. Their bodies remembered pleasure before their minds could label it treason. A surgical nurse who had seen men with limbs nearly taken by frost closed her eyes and cried into the cranberry sauce, and that sound loosened other faces. Where there had been training to hate, there was a small, sharp space where curiosity could slip in. The days after were a catalog of small betrayals of the old scripts. Radios arrived in wooden crates, and, when the needle fell on jazz, brass and piano filled the common room with an energy that had been outlawed as moral decay. For some, the music was a wound. Degenerate, they'd been told. For others it was a revelation, sound as evidence that the world they had been instructed to fear could also be vibrant, unruly, alive. Hilda, who had once turned in neighbors for whispering dissent, stood in front of the radio with tears streaking down her cheeks and admitted, with a voice that trembled between confession and relief, that she had always listened in secret. Her admission made others speak. A woman whose husband had been lost in the firebombing. A teacher who'd kept a band recording under her mattress. One by one, the lid lifted on private truths they had been too frightened to nourish. The music did not argue, it demonstrated. It played, and the room moved, and for the first time in years, hands unclenched into actual dancing. Small, awkward, a slow surrender to rhythms their leaders had called corrupt. Watching them, Maren felt an odd vertigo. History unspooled into way. Moments in the war's tidy categories frayed at the edges. Small mercies multiplied in ways that made her dizzy. A young corporal drove to town on his day off and returned with a pair of real glasses for a woman whose frames had been twisted by the strain of years. Another man left a thermos of coffee on a bedside table in the infirmary and an explanatory Life magazine that showed a dazzling screenlit Times Square. Maren sat with the pages open and felt light land on images of supermarket aisles and department store windows and an entire social order that functioned without ration cards. She asked one evening while clutching a warm mug, "Why are you giving me this?" And the nurse, whose father had fought in France and returned with nightmares, said simply, "We are people who do things for people." The answer was so plain it was almost offensive. It reframed everything. Kindness without calculus, abundance without strings, ordinary rituals carried out as if generosity were normal. That realization did not erase fear. It did not wipe clean memories of losses and betrayals. But it made the choice appear where once there had only been orders, the choice to see or to keep seeing the comfortable fabrications supplied by those who needed obedience more than truth. By the time the first December lights went up and a half-dozen guards carried in a tree, crowned by a blinking star, most of the women had already felt the old map scrunching in their pockets. Some would go home and fold the new truth away, carrying it like contraband. Others would find in the casual abundance and in the brittle, generous gestures, a chocolate bar, a shared cigarette, a radio's wild brass, a reason to step into an open life they had been taught to imagine as weakness. Maren held the memory of the chocolate between her teeth like proof. It had been only a small square of dark food, but it had become, in the seam of sleep and wakefulness, an argument she could not ignore. That ordinary kindness could defeat a whole curriculum of hate, one small human act at a time. The crate arrived just after lunch. 2 American soldiers hauled it into the common room, whistling as they set it down. The label stenciled on the side read, "Morale Equipment." The women stared as if it were unexploded ordnance. When the lid was pried open, the soldiers pulled out something cream-colored, heavy, gleaming under the weak winter light. A zenith radio. Large enough to seem important, fragile enough to seem forbidden. "All yours, ladies," one of the men said, dusting his hands. "Don't break it and don't worry. It bites less than we do." No one laughed. When they left, the radio sat on the table like a relic from another civilization. Its dials glinted. The cord snaked down to the floor where an outlet waited like a question. Maren's stomach tightened. She'd seen radios before. Propaganda boxes in Berlin shop windows, shouting victory reports even as bombs fell. Radios had been the mouth of the Reich, precise, metallic, commanding. This one looked different. Softer somehow. Curved edges, polished knobs, the faint hum of electricity waiting to speak. No one moved. No one wanted to be the first to touch it. Finally, Hilda stepped forward. Always Hilda. The woman still carried herself like the war wasn't over, spine straight, chin high, every gesture rehearsed. Her fingers hovered above the dial. "What if it's English?" someone whispered. Hilda didn't answer. She turned the knob. The sound that came out wasn't words, it was chaos. Static burst through the air, crackling like gunfire. Several women flinched, one crossed herself. Hilda kept turning the dial. The static rose, fell, shimmered, then, suddenly, music. A trumpet first, bright as sunlight. Then drums, not military drums, but something wild, loose, laughing. A saxophone climbed after them, sliding, teasing, unbothered by rules. Jazz. The women froze. Maren had heard it once years ago in a cafe in Hamburg before it was banned. A sailor had played a record for her, something American, something she'd pretended to dislike but secretly loved. Now it filled the room again, alive and unapologetic. Across from her, Greta blinked hard. "They told us this was filth," she whispered. "Music for degenerates." No one spoke. The brass section soared higher, daring them to breathe. The melody was free. Too free. It swung where German marches stomped. It laughed where their anthems demanded obedience. It was everything they had been warned against, and it was magnificent. Hilda's hand dropped from the dial. Her face had gone pale, her lips trembling. When the song ended, static filled the silence like ash after fire. Then another tune began, slower this time. A woman's voice. Smooth, smoky, heartbreak and silk. Someone whispered, "Turn it off." Hilda didn't. She just stood there, staring at the floor. The singer's voice wound through the air, low and wounded, and something inside Hilda snapped. Her shoulders sagged, her jaw unclenched. Then she said it, not loud but clear enough for every woman to hear. "I used to listen to this," she said. The words landed like a shell in the room's stillness. "In Berlin," she continued, her accent thickening. "My neighbor, an old widow, had a shortwave radio. Every Friday night I could hear this music through the wall. I would press my ear to the plaster and listen." Her eyes were wet now. And I knew we were lying. About this, about everything. Nobody breathed. She swallowed hard, voice breaking. "I turned people in, 3 of them, a clerk, a teacher, a mother, for defeatism, for crying too much. I reported them because I thought it made me loyal, because I believed." Her voice cracked. "But every Friday I listened to this music and did nothing." The song played on, the singer's voice curling through the confession like smoke. One woman began to cry. Another turned away, shaking. Marin's throat felt tight. She looked at Hilda, not the soldier, not the believer, but the woman now standing hollowed out by her own truth. "They play this in the mess hall," Hilda said suddenly, half laughing, half sobbing. "Did you notice last week during lunch nobody cared, nobody said it was corrupt. They just liked it." Her laughter turned ragged. "They don't have committees deciding what's pure. They don't arrest people for enjoying sound." She gestured toward the radio, her tears glinting. "And they're winning, and they're dancing while they do it." The room cracked. A few women stood abruptly and left. Others stayed frozen, hands over their mouths. The music kept playing, drums now, then trumpet, then the wild swing of a piano that refused to be tamed. Marin stood up. Slowly, carefully. She crossed to the center of the room where Hilda stood trembling beside the radio. She didn't speak. She just reached out her hand. Hilda blinked at her, confused. "Dance," Marin said softly. For a long second, Hilda didn't move. Then her shoulders began to sway, awkward, hesitant, mechanical. Another woman joined, then another. Before long, 11 of them were moving, shifting, stumbling, crying, laughing all at once. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't planned. It was what freedom sounded like when you'd forgotten the steps. The brass reached its crescendo, the drummer going wild, the trumpets clashing in a glorious, joyful mess. And for that one moment, standing barefoot on a wooden floor in a Mississippi POW camp, these women felt the world tilt. The empire that had taught them how to march had never taught them how to move like this. When the music faded into static again, the silence was unbearable. Hilda opened her eyes, her face streaked with tears. "They're going to offer us a choice soon," she said quietly. "To go home or stay. And when they do..." Her voice broke again. "I don't want to go back to a country where music has to be secret." Outside, the guards changed shifts, laughing. Inside, the radio glowed amber in the dark, its last note hanging like a prayer. No one turned it off. The fever came quietly, like an old debt finally collected. Elsa woke before dawn, shaking so hard her bunk rattled against the wall. The air in the barracks hung heavy and wet, and every swallow cut like glass. Dorothea was at her side in seconds, calling for the medic before Elsa could even speak. The last thing she saw before her knees gave out was the light flickering across the ceiling, like sunlight bending through water, and then blackness. When she opened her eyes again, she was somewhere else. Clean white walls, a window cracked open to let in air that smelled faintly of pine and antiseptic. The pillow under her head was soft, too soft. She turned her face to one side and saw a figure sitting at a small desk writing. The uniform was khaki, American, and the woman wearing it turned when she heard the sheets rustle. "Welcome back," she said. "You scared your friends half to death." Her accent was southern, drawn-out vowels, soft consonants. Her name tag read, "Ling Sarah Reeves." MD Elsa tried to speak but could only manage a rasp. "Don't," Sarah said gently. "Strep throat. We caught it early." She stood, filled a syringe from a glass vial and held it up to the light. "Penicillin," she explained. "You'll feel better by tomorrow." The word landed like a stone in water, ripples spreading through Elsa's fogged mind. Penicillin. The medicine she had read about in journals. The one German doctors had promised but never produced. She'd watched men die from infections that started with scratches. She'd mixed turnip broth in vodka pretending it helped. And now in captivity she was being given the thing her country could never make. The injection burned. She flinched, but Sarah didn't apologize. She just smiled and rolled down Elsa's sleeve. "That's the sting of getting better," she said, setting the syringe aside. Then she poured 2 cups of something dark from a dented thermos. "Real coffee? None of that ersatz stuff. Can you sit up?" Elsa nodded, barely, and Sarah helped her lift herself against the pillow. The smell hit her first, sharp, rich, electric. It made her eyes water. When the cup touched her lips, she nearly sobbed. The taste was bitter and perfect. Sarah watched her, not unkindly. "My dad fought in the first one," she said suddenly. "France, he was a medic too. Came home in 1919 with a medal and nightmares. Told me something once. The Germans you fight are just boys trying to go home." She took a slow sip of coffee. "He said hate is the easiest medicine to hand out. But it never cures anything." Elsa couldn't stop the tears. They came fast, unstoppable, falling down her fevered cheeks. Sarah didn't move to comfort her. She just let her cry. After a while, Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a magazine. Life December issue. She flipped it open and set it on Elsa's lap. Times Square on the cover. Bright neon signs, crowds, cars, people smiling. A world made of light. Elsa turned the pages with trembling fingers. Grocery stores with overflowing shelves, women choosing between 5 kinds of shoes, children holding chocolate bars in both hands. It didn't look like propaganda. It looked like a different planet. "Why?" Elsa asked finally, her voice a cracked whisper. "Why are you doing this for me?" Sarah stubbed out her cigarette in a metal tray. "Because that's what we do," she said simply. "You got sick." "I'm a doctor." "That's the whole story." Elsa pressed her face into her hands. For the first time, shame didn't feel like punishment. It felt like clarity. When she slept again, the fever broke. She woke to sunlight on the sheets, the hum of the radio in the next room. Someone was playing White Christmas. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. By evening, Sarah was back with a small carton of cigarettes. "For later," she said, setting them down. "You're cleared for release tomorrow. Don't try to work too soon." Elsa stared at the carton. 20 packs. More than she'd seen in years. "You're giving me this?" Sarah shrugged. "Why not? You look like you could use them." That night, Elsa lay awake under the thin cotton sheet staring at the ceiling. Outside, she could hear laughter from the guard's post, the sound of a ball hitting a glove, someone whistling a jazz tune she now knew by name. Count Basie. The same music that had made Hilda weep 3 weeks before. When morning came, she walked slowly back to the barracks, her throat still raw, but her mind clearer than it had been in years. The others gathered around her as she entered. Dorothea, Maren, even Hilda. Their questions came all at once. "They gave you penicillin?" "They cured it? Already?" Elsa nodded, too tired to speak. She sank onto her bunk, clutching the coffee cup Sarah had insisted she keep. "They have everything," she said softly. "Everything we were told they didn't." That afternoon, the guards announced Christmas preparations. The Americans carried in a tree, 15 feet tall, branches dripping with tinsel and colored lights. The women stood frozen, watching as soldiers hung ornaments and laughed about how hard it was to find a straight pine. Dorothea whispered, "Where did they get it?" "From the forest," Marin said. "A forest that isn't burning." By nightfall, the mess hall glowed. Cookies shaped like stars and trees lined the tables. Cranberry sauce again, turkey again, mashed potatoes shining under butter. A gramophone played Bing Crosby. When the meal ended, the camp commander, a gray-haired man from Kentucky, stood up on a chair. His voice was soft but steady. "Ladies, the war's ending. You'll be repatriated soon. But if any of you wish to stay, nurses, translators, teachers, we'll help with work visas. No one's forcing you. It's your choice." The room went silent. No one moved. Then Hilda stood, her voice clear and shaking. "I don't want to go back to a place where music is illegal." And like dominoes falling, hands rose across the room, one after another, quiet but certain. Marin's, Dorothea's, Greta's, Elsa's, the Americans clapped. The radio swelled again. Brass and laughter and the impossible rhythm of jazz. Elsa looked down at her plate. The red cranberry sauce had melted into the white potatoes, streaking pink through gold. She smiled through her tears. Once, she'd thought the color meant a mistake. Now it just looked like home. The Christmas tree arrived at dawn, carried on the shoulders of two laughing American soldiers who treated it like a trophy from the forest. Frost glittered on the pine needles. A silver star dangled from one man's pocket, swinging as they walked. The German women stopped mid-step in the yard, unable to believe what they were seeing. A real tree, 15 feet tall, full and fragrant, its branches whole, not wired together like the paper trees they'd made in basements back home. They watched in silence as the men carried it into the mess hall. When the doors swung shut behind them, the smell lingered, sharp and alive, pine and sap, the scent of winters that hadn't been poisoned by smoke or ration fires. Dorothea murmured, "There are forests here, real ones." Her voice was small, as if she were afraid to disturb the miracle. By noon, the camp was unrecognizable. The mess hall glowed under strings of colored bulbs. Paper chains looped across the rafters, red and green, so bright they almost hurt the eyes. Someone, probably Lieutenant Reeves, had found a gramophone, and Bing Crosby's voice drifted through the air, soft as snow. "I'm dreaming of a white Christmas." Elsa stood by the doorway, the memory of penicillin still fresh in her veins. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry again, but the sight of light bulbs twinkling on a pine tree undid her. Each bulb felt like defiance, a refusal to let darkness have the final word. The tables had been rearranged into one long line, and the women filed in, hesitant but hungry. Marin leaned toward her. "It smells like a bakery." Elsa nodded. There was flour in the air, sugar maybe, something impossibly rich. On the far table, a mountain of cookies waited, stars and trees frosted in white and red. The young American, guard from before Dixon, grinned as he caught their stares. "My mom sent 12 dozen," he said. "Eat all you want." Marin laughed weakly. "There's no limit?" "No limit," he said. "It's Christmas." For a moment, no one moved. Then Greta, the oldest among them, her gray hair pulled back in a braid, stepped forward, picked up a cookie, and took a bite. Her lips trembled. "Real sugar," she whispered. "Not beet, not powdered chalk." And just like that, the room exhaled, plates clattered, forks scraped. The Americans ate with the same appetite as the prisoners. No pretense, no performance. The turkey came out again, golden and steaming, and Elsa couldn't help laughing. "They're doing it again," she said to Dorothea. "More turkey." "It's Thursday," Dorothea said. "To them, maybe every day is a feast." The cranberry sauce glowed like stained glass under the lamps. Elsa took a small bite. The flavor hit her in a rush. Sweet, sour, sharp. Once she had thought it was dessert, a mistake on the plate. Now she understood it was meant to be there. That sweetness and salt could share space, that two things didn't have to be enemies to belong together. Halfway through the meal, Lieutenant Reeves rose from her seat, smiling. "Would anyone like cider?" she asked. It's warm, and maybe a little stronger than it should be. The Americans laughed. The German women followed cautiously, unsure of the joke but grateful for it anyway. Reeves poured the drink into tin mugs, steam curling from each one. Elsa took hers. It smelled of cinnamon and apples, childhood distilled into liquid. She took a sip. The taste burned pleasantly on the way down, spreading warmth through her chest. For the first time since arriving, the mess hall felt like something other than a room for prisoners. It felt like a village gathering, mismatched people bound together by the simple fact of being alive on the same December night. When the music shifted from Bing Crosby to Benny Goodman, laughter broke out among the guards. Thompson, a broad-shouldered corporal from Nebraska, lifted a leather football from under his chair and waved it in the air. "All right, ladies," he said. "Anyone here know how to play American football?" The women blinked at him, confused. Dorothea frowned. "Is it like soccer?" "Not even close," he said, grinning. "I'll show you." 15 minutes later, half the camp was outside in the cold, stamping their feet against the frozen earth while Thompson drew plays in the dirt with a stick. The football looked strange, like an egg stitched shut with leather. The women giggled nervously as he tried to explain touchdowns and end zones. Greta took the ball first. It slipped out of her hands, rolled toward the fence, and Maren chased it, laughing so hard she nearly fell. When she finally picked it up, she didn't stop running until she reached the wire. "Touchdown!" she shouted, breathless. No one corrected her. The Americans cheered. Even Hilda smiled, a real one this time, the kind that made her eyes soft. Elsa doubled over, clutching her sides, laughing harder than she had since 1939. By the time they returned inside, faces red and hair windblown, the tables had been pushed aside. The gramophone stood in the center of the room now, spinning Benny Goodman at full volume. Music spilled into every corner. Wild, brass-filled joy that made the walls feel wider. Hilda didn't resist it this time. She stepped forward, closed her eyes, and began to sway, the rhythm guiding her like a tide. One by one, others joined. Dorothea, Maren, Elsa, until a dozen women were moving together, some awkward, some graceful, all free in ways they'd forgotten they could be. Lieutenant Reeves clapped along, her cigarette glowing like a tiny star. Dixon twirled an invisible partner. The line between prisoner and guard blurred into something human, something fragile and enormous. When the music paused, the camp commander climbed onto a chair. His gray hair caught the colored lights. "Ladies," he said, his voice steady and kind, "the war's ending. You'll soon have a choice, to go home or to stay. Nurses, translators, teachers. This country has room for all kinds. Think about it." The silence that followed was immense. Then, slowly, Elsa raised her hand. "I want to stay," she said, her voice clear. "I don't want to go back to hunger." Hilda's hand rose next. "I don't want to go back to silence." Then Dorothea's, then Maren's, then nearly every woman in the room. Outside, snow began to fall, soft, uncertain flakes over Mississippi clay. Inside, the Americans started clapping, their applause rolling like thunder through the camp. And in that sound, that warmth and disbelief and mercy, the war finally ended. One quiet Christmas night at a table full of enemies who had learned how to share dessert. The morning after Christmas smelled like wood smoke and coffee. The camp was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy with unspoken things. The Americans had gone about their duties as usual, boots crunching on frosted ground, laughter echoing faintly from the kitchen. But inside Barracks 3, the women were awake early, lying still in their bunks, each replaying the same question in her mind. Could they really stay? Elsa sat on the edge of her bunk, the thin blanket bunched in her lap. Her throat was still tender, but the fever was gone, replaced by something sharper, a trembling awareness that she was standing on a line between two worlds. Germany meant home, but home no longer meant safety. Hamburg was rubble, her family scattered, her hospital gone. America absurdly, impossibly meant warmth. Coffee, medicine, music. A chance to breathe without waiting for the next air raid. Dorothea was the first to speak. They were serious, weren't they? she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Greta nodded slowly. They don't joke about paperwork. Hilda sat at the far end, staring at her hands. Work visas, translators, nurses. Her tone was flat, disbelieving. They'd let us live here after everything? Elsa looked up. After everything, she said softly, as if testing the words. The door creaked open. Lieutenant Reeves appeared, holding a clipboard and 2 mugs of steaming coffee. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. Morning, ladies, she said, her voice too bright for the hour. Commander asked me to remind you. If anyone's interested in applying, you'll need to see me before New Year's. No one spoke. The only sound was the slow drip of melting frost from the roof. Reeves sighed, set the mugs down on the table, and leaned against the doorframe. Look, she said, nobody's forcing you. Most of you will probably go home. But if you want to stay, if you think there's nothing left for you back there, and it will help. She started to leave, then paused. Think about it, she said gently. Sometimes winning means knowing when to start over. After she left, the silence grew unbearable. Elsa stood, walked to the table, and wrapped her hands around one of the mugs. The heat bit into her palms, grounding her. Start over, she repeated. Do you think we could? Marin laughed once, not cruelly, just hollow. Start over as what? Prisoners turned secretaries. People, Elsa said. Just people. Hilda lifted her head. There were dark circles under her eyes, but something fierce flickered behind them. You think they'd forget who we were? What we did? No, Elsa said. But they might forgive us before we forgive ourselves. That afternoon, the mess hall was rearranged again. The Americans had cleared out the tables, leaving rows of folding chairs. A bulletin board had been set up near the front, covered in papers stamped with official seals. Immigration forms, language school notices, lists of civilian job programs. At the center, a sign read, Post-Repatriation Opportunities, U.S. Civilian Placement Initiative, 1946. The women filed in quietly. Reeves stood at the front with Corporal Matthews, who held a stack of blank forms. If you're thinking of staying, she said, write your name. If not, no harm done. You'll be on the first ships home next month. For a moment, no one moved. Then from the second row, Dorothea stood. Her hands were shaking, but her chin was high. I'll stay, she said simply. She walked to the table and signed her name. It was like breaking a dam. Marin followed. Then Greta. Then Hilda. Her steps deliberate, her face unreadable. When she reached the table, she hesitated, pen hovering over paper. I don't want to go back to a place where music is dangerous, she said quietly. Then she signed. Reeves nodded once, her expression soft but unreadable. We'll take care of the rest, she said. By the time Elsa stepped forward, nearly half the room had already signed. The paper trembled under her hand as she wrote her name in careful letters. Elsa Reinhardt. Outside, the Mississippi winter was bright and strange. Sun on frost, blue sky that didn't look like war. When they stepped out of the hall, the air smelled faintly of smoke and roasted meat. The Americans were already setting up the evening meal. Someone had strung the word peace across the barracks in red ribbon. Marin stopped walking. They celebrate like they won something, she said. They did, Elsa replied. But not the way we thought. Later, as the sky turned gold, the women gathered by the fence. On the other side, soldiers were tossing a football again, shouting and laughing. Hilda leaned on the wire, her breath visible in the cold. Do you remember, she said, how we were told they were soft, undisciplined, corrupted by comfort? Greta laughed quietly. If this is corruption, she said, I'd trade every speech I ever heard for one more plate of turkey. They all laughed then, not bitterly, but freely. The kind of laughter that feels like air after drowning. Night fell. The mess hall lights glowed through the windows, soft and warm. Elsa lingered outside for a long time, watching shadows move across the curtains, silhouettes of soldiers and nurses, of people who once would have been her enemies. She thought of Sarah Reeves, of her steady hands and kind eyes, of Lieutenant Reeves's voice saying, start over, of the cranberry sauce on her first day, sweet and red and strange. Maybe this was what starting over looked like. Inside, the gramophone started again, playing softly through the glass. I'll be seeing you. The kind of song that didn't demand belief, just forgiveness. Elsa turned away from the fence and walked back toward the barracks. Behind her, the music carried on, bright and easy like a country that didn't know how to stop giving. The night the letters arrived, the barracks hummed like a hive. Footsteps, whispers, the rustle of paper, every sound pulled taut. It was late when a NCO from headquarters came through with a stack of envelopes stamped with neat official seals, and for a beat everyone forgot how to breathe. Names were called in a clipped voice. Who had paperwork approved, who would be scheduled for interviews, who would be sent home. A small metal table under a bare bulb became the center of a new kind of reckoning. Hilda stood a few paces back, the Hershey locket heavy against her chest like a secret kept too long. She watched as women opened envelopes with hands that trembled for reasons that had nothing to do with cold. Some faces went bright with hope. Others closed like shutters. Margaret's hands fumbled with her letter until she could read the signature, a stamp from immigration and the captain's recommendation pinned beneath it. She pressed the paper flat against her palm and laughed, an edge-sharp sound that was almost disbelief. Rosita unwrapped her small bundle of things, a Coca-Cola bottle, now just an empty glass monument she would carry home in her mind for years. Hilda noticed how each small object, wrapper, bottle, a pair of glasses, had become proof that something other than propaganda existed. They moved toward one another then, women who had eaten the same meager rations and shared the same secret nights listening to jazz. The barracks filled with murmurs. Who will try for a visa? Who has family waiting? Who simply wants a ship ticket and a train home to Rubble? The options were uneven and raw. Some could not imagine leaving the old soil that had been both cradle and wound. Others had tasted thawing abundance and could not return easily to scarcity. Later, when the mess hall emptied and the guards had gone to check forms in the administration office, Hilda sat at the end of a long wooden table. Annalise came and sat opposite her, hands folded like someone holding a small animal. The two women had been through 1,000 small betrayals and consolations. Reports handed in, blankets shared. A Hebrew prayer hummed in the infirmary corner at dawn. Now there was simply the weight of decision to be carried. I thought I knew who I was, Annalise said quietly. I thought I knew the measure of things. Now, she let the sentence trail as if the remainder didn't fit the world anymore. Hilda opened the little folded wrapper and touched the crinkled silver like a relic. I told them everything, she said. Her voice was steady but small. The confession had been a clean strike through months of silence. It had not undone what she'd done, but it had set something in motion. They will check. They will ask. I don't know what comes next. Annalise reached across and took Hilda's hand. It was a human currency, no signatures, no affidavits, just fingers clasped. You have done what many couldn't, she said. You named the lie. That is more than some of us could bear. The compliment landed like rain on parched ground. Simple, immediate, and oddly forgiving. Outside, the Mississippi wind carried echoes of laughter from a far corner, where American families had gathered. Someone played a record on a small wind-up gramophone they had been allowed to borrow. A Benny Goodman clarinet lifted the air for a moment. A child somewhere shouted, and the sound threaded through the compound like a bright ribbon. It was ordinary and unbearable at the same time, an ordinary that had once been unimaginable. Julius came by then, carrying a stack of paperwork in that small civilian awkwardness men have when they mean well and don't know how to say it. He'd been up before dawn helping sort files, driving 5 towns away to secure a letter, stitching together whatever red tape could be bent into a lifeline. He sat down, careful not to make a show, and handed Hilda a folded page. They'll start the petition process next week, he said. Your form's been flagged for priority because of your language skills. Lieutenant Reeves sent a note. Hilda looked at the page, at the neat recommendation. For a fraction of a second, she felt dizzy. Then something like steadiness settled in. The small machine of civil kindness, signatures, a note in the margin, a man willing to run errands on his day off, assembled itself into a practical miracle. She tucked the paper into her tunic as if it were an extra shirt against the cold. That night, beneath the string light still hanging above the parade ground, there was a small send-off. It wasn't a parade or an official ceremony. Too many things still lay unresolved for pomp. But there were hot cider mugs passed from hand to hand, and scraps of song learned awkwardly from both languages. Women who would soon return to Germany wrapped each other in thin blankets and said the private things one says when the future is uncertain. Please be safe. Write. Do not forget us. A few spoke promises of letters and parcels, of news from a country that had seemed a myth. Hilda moved through that crowd like someone carrying both a confession and a hope. She paused by the doorway where Sergeant Davis and Lieutenant Reeves stood, their faces tired but bare of posture. "Thank you," she said in English, the two syllables heavy with meaning. Davis tipped his head, an honest, simple gesture. Reeves offered a small official smile and squeezed her arm in a way that had nothing to do with rank. When at last she lay back in her bunk, the barracks around her clattering with quiet, she thought about all the small proofs that had overturned certainties. A turkey served on a Thursday, a Hershey wrapper folded into a pendant, a pair of glasses that sharpened not only sight but possibility. She understood the rest would be slow and bureaucratic and painful and utterly human. Forgiveness, if it came, would not be a single night or a signed form. It would be the long accumulation of small decencies. Outside, the stars were cold and many. Hilda pressed the wrapper to her chest and closed her eyes. Tomorrow the paperwork would move another step. Tomorrow some women would leave and others would stay. Tomorrow she would walk to the office and put her name down and, whatever the State Department decided, she had finally chosen to live with consequence rather than continue to live in denial. The choice felt like an unlatched door. She breathed and let the new air fill her lungs. Around her, the camp slept with the fragile confidence that comes after confession. Not absolution, but the honest beginning of something that could be repaired. The clarinet had long since stopped, but she could still hum the last notes under her breath, as if to remember that music had taught them how to move again. Years later, long after the fences came down and the camp at Mississippi turned into farmland again, an old woman named Hilda Brenner walked through the aisles of an American grocery store. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The air smelled faintly of oranges and waxed floors. She paused by the refrigerated section, running her fingers over a row of cranberry sauce jars. Glossy red, neatly labeled, stacked 3 deep. For a moment, the noise of the store faded. She was back in that mess hall, the taste of turkey and sweetness colliding on her tongue, the shock of realizing that abundance wasn't a crime, it was a way of living. Behind her, a child tugged at his mother's sleeve, holding up a jar of the same sauce. "Can we get this one?" he asked. The mother smiled. "Sure, honey. It's Thanksgiving." Hilda smiled too, the kind that starts in the chest before it reaches the face. Thanksgiving. A word that once meant confusion and fear, now soft as breath. She placed one jar in her cart, turning it slowly in her hands as if it were made of memory. At home, her daughter, American-born, impatient, beautiful, called from the kitchen. "Mom, where'd you learn to make cranberry sauce like this? Everyone says it's the best." Hilda chuckled quietly, her accent still clinging to certain words after 50 years. "A long time ago," she said. "In a place where I thought it was dessert?" The girl laughed, not understanding, not needing to. The war was history to her. Black and white photographs, not hunger or shame. Hilda didn't correct her. She stirred the sauce slowly, watching the steam rise and curl like smoke from a past that had finally stopped burning. Every year she made the same meal: turkey, mashed potatoes, and bright red sauce spooned generously over the plate. And every year, as the family gathered around the table, she would look at the food and think of the faces that had first taught her what peace tasted like. Elsa, who'd cried into her coffee. Marin, who'd danced to jazz for the first time. Dorothea, who'd whispered, "Maybe they're not weak." And Sarah Reeves, the young American doctor with the steady hands and Texas drawl, who'd offered penicillin without hesitation and coffee without judgment. She still remembered the smell of that infirmary. She still remembered how it felt to wake up and find herself alive because someone she was taught to hate had decided she was worth saving. Outside, wind rattled the window pane. She looked out across the yard where her grandson was tossing a football in the fading light, leather arcing through the air, laughter echoing. The same sound she'd once heard in a POW camp. The same game she'd thought was madness. Now it was just life. Ordinary, unremarkable, miraculous. She sat down, wiped her hands, and pulled a small box from the cupboard. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, lay a square of foil, the last piece of the Hershey wrapper she'd kept for half a century. It had dulled over time, but when the light hit it just right, it still gleamed. She touched it with the same reverence she once had for prayer. "This," she whispered, "was the first thing that told me the world could change." Her daughter appeared in the doorway, holding plates. "Mom?" "Coming," Hilda said, tucking the wrapper away. She stood, smoothing her apron, her movements slower now but still precise. The nurse's hands never forgot. As she walked to the table, the smell of roast turkey filled the house. Laughter rose around her, bright, unguarded, easy. She placed the cranberry sauce at the center, beside a bowl of mashed potatoes that gleamed like white silk under the kitchen light. She looked around, her daughter, her son-in-law, her grandchildren, none of them born from the ashes she came from, yet somehow carrying pieces of that history in their joy. Hilda lifted her glass. "To Thanksgiving," she said softly, "and to the day I learned it was not a trick." No one fully understood, but they toasted anyway. Outside, the evening settled over the town, the same country that once taught her that mercy could be stronger than fear. And somewhere deep inside her chest, she still heard the faint echo of a clarinet, wild and free, playing the music that had once broken her heart open enough to let light in. If this story moved you, don't just watch history, remember it. Subscribe to WW2 Frontline for more true human stories from the war, where mercy, music, and meals told the real end of conflict.